And then you can start. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm just going to share my screen out first. So today I'm going to be talking to you about stitching narratives. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I think are 7 tips for connecting communities through libraries and also through the textile world, which is what I write about. So I'm Leanne Prain. I'm an author. I've written 3 books. So I co-authored a book in 2009 called Yarn Bombing, The Art of Knitting Crochet Graffiti, with a woman named Mandy Moore. And then in 2011, I wrote a book called Hoopla, The Art of Unexpected Embroidery. And this past fall, I wrote a book called Strange Material, a storytelling through textiles. So with all 3 books, what I've done is I've found artists who work with textiles, and often these textiles are not just textile works that are produced and hung in a gallery, but either works that reflect the stories of a community or stories that helped build and bolster their community. So what I'm going to do today is show you some examples that I've come across that hopefully will inspire you in your work, whether you do community programming or you help people with research, or there's something that you want to do working in libraries as a staff in order to foster either reading or making, or conversations between reading and making. I have a creative writing degree. I went to the University of British Columbia, which is one of Canada's most well-known creative writing programs. And one of the things they made me do when I was in that program is really study stories. So they make you write in all sorts of disciplines: poetry, fiction, screenwriting. And you know, I went on with my life after I graduated and started working as a graphic designer, and sort of fell into actually writing about textiles when I was a student. And in my first 2 books, I just started realizing that, you know, we see textiles as visual, functional things, but what we don't see behind them necessarily is there's this wealth of unrecognized stories. So I was going to take you through a little bit of my journey on that. If you've seen my books, people tend to think that textiles are this, you know, subversive textiles and storytelling is a modern notion, but it really isn't. And one thing I think that libraries can do for either artists or people wanting to work with textiles is really unearth those stories that we don't really know much about or sort of have got forgotten. And I love this piece. I thought I'd show a couple of historical examples to just show that people have always been working with stories in textiles. So this is the Kentucky Graveyard Quilt. And if you haven't seen it before, it was made in 1836. It was started by a woman named Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell. And she had a 2-year-old who had died. And she had made this as a Victorian mourning quilt to remember the child who had died. And if you look at the surface of it, beyond the 8-pointed stars and the black and white squares, there's something really unusual about this quilt, which is it actually has coffins on it. And what this woman had done actually is created a graveyard in the center of the quilt. And as she lost family members, starting with this young son that had died and then another son, she moved a coffin from the edge of the quilt into the center of it to mark a passage of time. And it is a bit morbid because as different members of the family were people were born into the family, she started making more and more coffin patches. But the idea, of course, is it's not just a quilt to keep somebody warm. It's also sort of a house of memory. And so you have this history that's not necessarily written in a book, but it's created by textiles. And so that's sort of where my work started in terms of researching, you know, how can textiles reflect people's lives, and how does story interact with textile pieces? This is another example. This is a jacket of a woman named Agnes Richer. And Agnes was in an Austrian asylum in the 1890s, and she was a seamstress by trade. And she did what any seamstress would do. She kept sewing and stitching, and this is actually her straitjacket. And she fashioned it into a very attractive jacket, but then also started journaling with embroidery. And people have studied this jacket and tried to figure out what her messaging was. And because she was interned so long, there are stitches on top of stitches, and you can only make out phrases. And it says maybe my morning jacket, my white stockings. And this actually inspired a book. There's a psychologist, Gayle Hornstein, who wrote a book, Agnes's Jacket, a psychologist's search for meaning in madness. So again, these are things that you may have in your archives. You may have stories of these hidden in books. As you start to look at collections, you might find that there are mentions of textiles you might not have noticed before. So I'd encourage you to take note of what you discover, because I think that's the one thing where researching textiles has become a passion of mine, because we still don't have a lot about textiles. I mean, they've been considered women's work, and they've been ignored. And I think they're a really powerful and potent subject matter that we're just starting to rediscover. And we have so many historical examples that still need to be pulled out of archives and people's personal stories and news stories. So where I've sort of come in researching this is sort of from the back end. I actually started looking at textiles just out of a sense of curiosity and joy when I was writing my first book, Yarn Bombing. And I came about yarn bombing in a very unusual way. I actually came about it as a researcher. I was in a publishing program, and I'd pitched a book on knit graffiti. And as part of a student project. And I never actually thought I would be writing a book on knit graffiti or yarn bombing. So suddenly I was tasked with figuring out, what is this movement? What is yarn bombing? And if I could see all of you in person, I would ask you, who's heard of yarn bombing at this point? And my prediction is probably 60 to 70% of you would raise your arms. 5 years ago, I used to ask this question in rooms, and maybe 3 people would raise their hands. And that's because yarn bombing's only really been around since 2007. So I was a student in a program where I was asked to write a book on yarn bombing, just as a student project. And then a publisher got involved and said, we really want you to write a book on yarn bombing. And so Mandy Moore, who I had pitched as my fake author, and I thought, well, let's go ahead and actually write a real book and start talking to artists and figure out what is yarn bombing and what does it look like. So if you haven't heard of yarn bombing, and its most basic sense, yarn bombing is a knitted or crocheted piece wrapped around a pole. So this is yarn bombing in its most basic form. But it can also be many other things. It can be a tree covered in crochet, like this piece by Carol Hummel up in the upper right. It can be a phrase stitched into a piece of work, like this "What's Up" piece. It can be a little cozy tag that adorns a button. So as I started to research what this is, I got more and more ideas. It can be a covered vest. This is a piece that was orchestrated by Magda Saik, who's sort of the godmother of knit graffiti. And she came up with the design of this, but it was made by many volunteers who got together and crocheted these big panels for a bus in Mexico City. And so what I learned in terms of researching yarn bombing and asking different artists, like, why do you do this? A bunch of different themes came up for me. And one of the main themes that I always get from people is joy. It brings me great joy. And the other thing I get back from people is it's a way to get people involved. So if you haven't tried yarn bombing and yarn bombing through a library, it's something that I've seen a lot of librarians and community groups do to facilitate stories and excitement about a community and coming together and building something together. I've done a few projects myself. I've seen projects as simple as hearts woven into a fence. So this actually doesn't take any knitting or crochet skill. You can just find a local place and start wrapping yarn. I've seen school-age children do this with flowers and weave vines through fencing. I've taught workshops where people make pom-poms. And so we call them yarn bomb pom-poms or pom-pom bombs, rather than teaching the whole skill of knitting and crochet, which can take a little bit of time to learn. In Pittsburgh, a community group came together to celebrate the city's bridges. So this is the Andy Warhol Bridge in Pittsburgh. And this is a grassroots project to build community. people were asked to complete squares and help put them up. So they had hundreds of people come together for this project. It celebrated their city, and there was a visual mark of people coming together to build what their community story was, which was it's a city of bridges. It's only connected by the metalwork that connects one community from another. And then people knit in place. They had meetings. I'm sure they talked when they made things, which always seems to occur in groups of people who sit and stitch. There's the physical act of putting something up that's been designed by a group. And then after it's up for a while, there's the physical act of taking things down and recycling things. What do you do with these things when they come down? Excuse me. This is a project, excuse me, sorry. This is in Christchurch. Has anybody seen this piece? This was a container that was placed after pardon me, just a second to recover from my cough there. This was a container that was put out after the earthquake in Christchurch in 2011. And this artist thought, well, let's brighten and cozy things up. Let's add some whimsy to a landscape when people have been really struggling with an environmental disaster. So the call was put out for different people to send squares. And squares came from England, from Germany, Australia, and from Sweden. I'm sorry, this is Christine Reich of Sumner who put this together. So again, this is a community rallying around a certain cause through yarn bombing. So that's sort of how yarn bombings led me into thinking about community work. But what I would say is I've got 7 tips. So I'm going to go through and show some examples. Tip 1 is encourage unusual ideas and techniques. So I think one of the things that happens when people are crafting is we think, oh, knitting needs to look perfect, or embroidery needs to look perfect. And in terms of researching my books, I think I found anything but. I think the more you can consider things that are unusual and wild, the more interesting ideas you get, the more uptake you get from people. And I really solidified my thinking around this when I was introduced to Alexandra Walters. So Alex is an artist who lives in Oklahoma, and she's completely self-taught. These are 2 self-portraits that she's created. And one of them is created on a piece of military work. She's actually a military wife. And the other, the one on pink, is actually on a hospital smock. And it was actually a hospital smock taken from the hospital where she was born. And she went back to art school and she went back to nursing school and started stitching on portraits on this smock. And she's completely self-taught, and she only does 1 stitch. So you could look at an embroidery book and say, oh, well, we need to do this project with 10 different stitches. But I think Alex is a great example of somebody who can create beautiful work with 1 stitch. But Alex also was blogging and putting her work up online around 2009 and receiving a great deal of criticism. And part of the reason she was receiving criticism is she was stitching pills of Prozac and lithium and items from her lifestyle as a military wife. So, guns and things people were quite angry about. They said those things don't belong on a tea towel. And around the same time, she entered a competition for Stitch a Famous Person from Oklahoma. And she thought, well, I'm going to stitch the person who's had the most impact on my life, which is the inventor of the AK-47. And so this is a portrait of Mikhail Kalashnikov, who invented the AK-47, because she's a wife who is in the military. And she submitted this portrait to a juried competition. And the competition came back with 2 pieces of feedback from her. The first piece of feedback was, this is totally inappropriate subject matter. How dare you? So that's debatable. Like, what can you and can't you create and craft? And 2, your technique is terrible. So, and that's something I think that people who make things hear often, is that there's only one right way to do something. And if you look at most of your collection, I would say, for crafts and textiles, there's probably one way to do things. And I think that can be really limiting. And especially if you're doing community projects, I would encourage you to think, well, what can we do with just one skill, or a skill that's easier, something that can be done with little hands? Because I studied art history as an undergrad alongside my creative writing degree, and I would say that Alex's work is incredibly artistic. And who's to judge that technique? And I think people can really get held up in terms of technique over idea. This is another self-taught artist. This is Ray Matterson. So Ray actually learned how to stitch when he was incarcerated, and he really wanted to have a Yankees logo. So he bartered for some cloth men's shorts and an athletic sock that had a yellow and blue thread and a needle and a Tupperware lid, and he just started stitching. And now he's become an artist who's known throughout the world, and these pieces are literally the size of a baseball card. And he just started stitching pieces from his life. But I mean, again, this is just one stitch and somebody who's completely self-taught. Johnny Murder's another person, and this I thought it would be interesting to include because, of course, this image makes people uncomfortable. But one of the really interesting things about Johnny is he stitches for a bed hobby. He wanted something relaxing, and Johnny has Tourette's, so stitching for him is a way of emotional release and therapy. And finally, this is my last artist working with one stitch. This is Aubrey Longley Cook. So Aubrey is actually an animator by trade, and what Aubrey does is create embroidered animations. So of all the works that he's done, this is one of my favorites. This is an animated GIF you can find on the internet. But what he did is took his training as an animator and decided, how can I apply something called the walk cycle, which all animation students do, and make a dog run. So he's done 12 embroideries that he's then photographed individually, and they actually become a movie of a running dog. And then he's photographed the back of it with all the knots and gnarls. And there's also an embroidery of the back of the knots and gnarls of the dog running. And this particular dog is actually a dog his roommate had. And his roommate said the dog would always bolt. No matter how well loved this dog was, it would always bolt. So this piece is called Runaway. And I mean, there's this nice correlation between embroidery and animation, and how do they work? And can you imagine maybe a young animator wanting to learn more about embroidery and figuring out how does that work within your work? So, I mean, one of the other things I would think about is somebody's coming into your library asking about one subject matter. It's interesting to see where there's crossovers and unexpected connections. So my step 2 is, there's lots of ideas to make literature accessible through whimsy. There is something really wonderful about textiles being tactile and something that people react to, and people want to touch them. They evoke memory. And this is one wonderful project called the Knitted Poem. So this was done by the UK Poetry Society, and it is the world's largest poem. And this project actually was done, it was designed overall by 2 textile artists that came and helped the society. And then thousands of knitters and crocheters volunteered for this project, and they each knit a letter, but they had no idea what the end poem would be until it was put together. So you're creating in the dark, knowing that you were working in the service of poetry. And each of these squares are 12 inches each. And the entire blanket measures 13 by 9 meters. And the final poem is a Dylan Thomas poem called In My Craft or Sullen Art. And there's this wonderful correlation between stitching and poetry, that they both take time and patience and effort. So it was something that the people making things could ruminate on while they were making these letters. And then later, just like you would reveal a garment when it was done, this wonderful poem was revealed in the end blanket. I would encourage you to go to the Knitted Poem website, because there's some wonderful little widget they put on the website where you can actually write your own poem and you can submit it to the site, and then it will create a knitted blanket. It's a graphic that gets generated by the website. It's a really fun tie-in to this project. There's some neat things that they chose to do online at the time too. Tracy Wittes is actually an artist that works, she makes all these 3D machine knit characters. And I did an interview with her asking about character development through art and design. So the black and red piece is her version of Krampus. And she said when she's researching, she just looks at hundreds and hundreds of images to try and figure out how do you take a traditional character and craft and turn them into a 3D knitted dimensional piece. And the green piece here is Jabberwocky. So this is another neat idea with making is how would you invite people to create their own 3D dimensional versions of well-loved characters. And I could see this potentially being something where, you know, it doesn't need to be something as time-consuming as stitching, but, you know, Sculpey or clay or Play-Doh for children's program. How many images can you look at, and what's your 3D rendering of something that we often see 2D? This is Augustina Woodgate. So Augustina is the well known as the poetry bomber now. She's actually a visual artist, and this was her first foray into poetry. And she was involved with Miami Poetry Festival a few years ago. And the man that she was working with was very, very excited about putting poetry in all sorts of places in the public, putting poems where they wouldn't normally go. So he was putting poetry on fake parking tickets and leaving them on cars. He was doing inserts of poetry and leaving them in menus and rack cards that would sit on tables. And the two of them brainstormed this idea of actually putting poems on tags that would then get sewn into clothing at thrift stores. And she decided to go about this very much like yarn bombing in a guerrilla fashion, just enter into businesses and stitch them into the seams of coats and jackets and pants, and then people would find them. She did get kicked out of a few stores when she was doing this. There ended up being actually a viral video of her working, so it ended up being quite a bit of a promotion for the poetry festival. But there was this nice thing of poetry suddenly belonging to everyone and being found in unexpected places. So it was sort of taken out of just the sphere of regular poetry readings to the festival and put into public life. She's since done this project also with community groups. So she works at a women's shelter, and the women also write their own poems. So often they work together with figuring out what should go in tags, and those are put into clothing that are sold at sales as well. So in terms of putting things out there as well, I would say look for what the underappreciated histories are in your community and stories. In your community, there's all sorts of stories that we don't think are important, but they're important to somebody, and they should be captured. You'll find out what people are passionate about and what they want to celebrate, and they might not be something that's in written history right now. Textiles have always been good for capturing things that maybe haven't made it onto the pages of books yet. This is an artist, Sherry Lynn Wood, who does a variety of textile projects. This is one of my favorite because I truly think it is a history. In 2009, she completed this project called the Cloth Baby Doll Project. And Sherry was studying in San Francisco at an artist colony, coming up with some projects. And she started to find these cloth baby dolls in thrift stores. And in the 90s, there were women who were starting to become professional tattoo artists for the first time around the Bay Area in San Francisco. And so what Sherry did is she sent each doll away to a tattoo shop owner who was female and asked them to draw their own designs, because all of them have their own illustrative design on the body of a doll. And so these female artists would draw these in and send the doll back to Sherry. And because women in tattoo art, owning their own shops and coming up with their designs, receiving apprenticeship is a really new thing. What Sherry really did was capture the tattoo art at a time where women really weren't making it into tattoo magazines or tattoo shops. But she's created this history entirely in embroidery on these dolls. So it's interesting to sort of see where this history is being created and captured And it's not in a traditional sense. It's in, it's in an artist's hands, and they're on three-dimensional objects. Mark Newport is another artist that works with similar ideas. So Mark's in Detroit, Michigan, and he plays a lot with themes of masculinity. So these are two of his pieces. There's Batman 3, and a character of his own invention, Bobbleman. And what Mark does is he looks at comic books and images of men as the superhero in popular culture. And then he recreates these pieces in knitting and crochet, some machine knitting. He also makes quilts out of comic books. And he'll change things. So much like using news stories in collage to make poetry, he'll look at a comic book panel and cover over parts of the story to create a new story with embroidery and stitching. And this is another more modern history. So we always consider embroidery as something where we do samplers and traditional capturings of things that are very quaint and twee. This is an artist, Aviva Olnick, and this is part of a series called Embroidered Confessionals. And these are about the size of a hanky, so they're about 4 by 6. And Aviva actually stitches her own handwriting, so they're quite small. And it's a modern dating history that she's chronicled here. She's been dating on online sites, and Plenty of Fish, and OkCupid, and those sorts of things, and deciding to record her diary on pieces of cloth. So, stories don't always have to be written on a page. Sometimes a story can be created in embroidery. And I think this is something beyond Aviva's experience that anybody could try and do. She has a new project now where she's actually embroiders people's tweets. So people are using Twitter to send her a tweet, and then she'll recreate that in embroidery as well. So I'm curious to know what you think goes unnoticed in your collections. And when artists come in, I think one of the best things you can do for community programming is figuring out who your allies are and how you can help people research their ideas. Because there's a wealth of stories, and I think sometimes once artists have those stories at their fingertips, there's so much they can do with them. Tamara Stone's a good example of that. So Tamara actually creates other people's stories on the physical form of a doll's bed. So this is a small doll's bed that she's actually embroidered the coverlet, sheets, and even the mattress. And this piece is called At the End of a Long and Tedious Journey. And what she's taken, this is one of many pieces where she's collected stories of different women who were traveling the Overland Trail and moving out west in America and trying to articulate their lives. So she's gone through and done historical research with letters and news clippings and medical reports. And as she sort of formed the story of the subject, she's applied them onto these bedclothes. But the really interesting thing about these bedclothes is the bed also works like a book. So you can't read the whole story on one piece. You physically have to pull off the covers. And you have to look at the sheet. And you have to pull off the sheet and read the rest of the story on the fitted sheet. And then to really get the full story, you have to go down to the mattress. And part of the reason of doing this is Tamara really likes the idea of somebody interacting with this bed, like doing women's work to get at these women's stories. And often these were stories that were sort of covered up. You're not going to find them in a history book, but you will find them in other places when you research. Bettina Metzicun is an artist who lives in my city and here in Vancouver, Canada. And she actually moonlights in the library system when she's not working on her maps. And she does a whole bunch of different textile work. She's very influenced by symbols, and she does a lot of things with weather maps and sail maps. But she loves wordplay and map making. And this is her romantic archaeological, which was inspired by looking at different maps. So she has, this is all based on romantic relationships. So she has Repository Island as a piece, or the Sea of Good Hope, the waterfall at the end of the world. So she's gone through and just collected different ideas and applied them to a landscape. So what started with research became very fantastical. Marion Coleman is an artist who lives in the Bay Area of San Francisco, just outside of San Francisco in Oakland. And Marion is an African-American woman who can also remember a lot of segregation happening in the United States. And as a part of this segregation history is there were many Black African-American nurses, and that's a history that's also gone unrecorded. She's a multimedia artist, so she works in image and words. So these are actually, this is a handmade quilt where she's used photo transfers from historical photos and collaged them on with her own stitching and embroidery. And if you were to look at this piece up close, it's very, very layered. But what's important in this piece to her was that this is a history you really can't find anywhere. If you're an African-American woman and you had a baby, you couldn't go to a hospital that was for white people. You often had to rely on a midwife. So it's capturing a history that really doesn't exist anywhere else. And because of the nature of caring and communities intersecting, textiles was the perfect medium for this piece. On a more sinister note, this is a UK artist named Freddie Robbins, and this is the knitted homes of crime. So you can see in this image there's many houses here. Freddie got really inspired by crime reports of the Victorian era and how they talked about women. And she thought, well, each of these crimes that I've uncovered has taken place in the domestic sphere. They've all been in homes. And so what she decided to do was create these scenes where crime had occurred in the form of a tea cozy. So what she's done is she's gone through each of these historical letters. Usually there were women who protected themselves in self-defense cases is what we would consider it these days. But she looked at the language of how these women were treated and decided to knit the scene where the crime had happened. And each of these pieces is displayed with a long story that goes into a little bit of how they were described in the Victorian crime rosters as being very sinister rather than protecting themselves. So there's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's a little bit historical research, looking back at what the houses actually looked like, trying to recreate them in stitch work. And the collection itself becomes its own story of how women have been treated and how language can really shape our opinion of somebody. So tip 5, make something together. So I think it's really powerful to be able to gather people together and host a community action. So here's some examples of things that I've seen done. This is Marianne Jorgensen. So Marianne Jorgensen is an artist who was really upset about what was going on with the Iraq War and Europe's involvement in it. So what she decided to do was ask people to knit squares. And the idea is these beautiful pink squares would all be banded together and cover a symbol of war. So it started in Denmark, and it's gone through several countries in the world of people just putting together pink squares. So it's making something really, really simple. But when the pink blanket's applied to something like a tank, the meaning changes. And the nice thing about projects like this is it allows people to get involved. So you might have a lot of anger or hope, or you want to bring attention to something, but really in knitting a square, the power is in the community of people working together and putting something together. I've worked with Betsy Greer, who's an American writer, and she's actually coined a term called craftivism, which is the act of craft and activism put together. So this is an example of craftivism. Which actually Betsy inspired the UK Craftivists, which are another group that works with craft and activism. This group was really concerned about the fact that young people weren't voting in the UK, and thought, well, maybe voter reform needed to happen as well. So they're not just making something, they're actually allowing other people to make things by creating cross-stitch and embroidery patterns. They distribute for free online, and they encourage anybody to go ahead and make an embroidery that says vote, or many of their other free patterns. So they're inspiring other people to make by reproducing patterns for the public. This is a project that I was involved with several years back. There's an artist, a writer here named Joy Kagawa in Vancouver, and she wrote Aubuchon. It's one of Canada's most famous novels. And where I live here in Vancouver, unfortunately, our property prices are as high as New York City. We're one of the, after Hong Kong, we're the most expensive housing market on earth. So property here is really hard to obtain. And Joy's family had lived here in Vancouver up until the Second World War. And Canada did a really shameful thing in the Second World War, which is we saw the Japanese as a threat, and even our Japanese Canadians were rounded up and put in internment camps. And the families who were put into internment camps lost everything. They lost their homes, they lost all of their possessions. And Joy's family was one of the families this happened to. So her childhood home is here in Vancouver, and of course, with a writer's salary, she could have never afford to buy it back. But we had a nonprofit group that did step in and try and buy it as a writer's residency. And in the backyard, there's a cherry tree that's been made very famous here in North America by a children's book that Joy wrote, Naomi's Tree. So the tree was actually dying, and they thought, well, let's bring attention to it. Let's get a bunch of people to knit and celebrate the house and celebrate Joy's work and celebrate this tree before it goes away. So Mandy and I actually got together and asked the community to help us yarn bomb a tree, and it is a cherry tree. So we thought, well, what would be more perfect than cherry blossoms? So we put a call out. We just went onto our blog and announced that we were going to be knitting cherry blossoms. The house hosted several knit-ins. We spread out the word through librarian organizations. City Hall had us in to knit and crochet. And we had over 500 blossoms come from all out through North America. We had school children knit. You can see in the top photo, the city sent us some firefighters to help us decorate the tree. And so this one little tree with one simple project, one cherry blossom pattern, really became a symbol of community and the lit community here, and how all of us can work together to celebrate a cause and fundraise for this house. So that was a project that I was really proud to be involved in, and it was amazing how something so simple could get people really rallied behind a cause. Many of the little flowers actually came with notes from community members, and particularly a lot of the Japanese Canadian community who, definitely can relate to Joy's story and had their own family stories that they wanted to share as well. So if you were to look at potentially running a project, like a craftivism project within a library, there really is no limit to what you could choose to do. And I love this chart. This is actually made by my friend Betsy. How does craftivism work? Like, what is it? Basically, it's anything that you can make. You can crochet, you can knit, you can embroider, you can needlepoint, you can frame, you can quilt, you can stitch something. That's the key word. And then you just need to pick a cause, and it could be anything. So against cancer, against a disorder, for a sick relative, against a political jerk. This is my favorite, for a political jerk, for awareness. So it's really, making something for a cause is something that gets people rallied together. It's just figuring out what works best for your community and what people are passionate about. And as you interact with the public, I'm sure you hear those stories of what really excites people or gets people going. So tip number 6 is, why craft in something like a library or an institutional space? I wouldn't call libraries institutional spaces, but I do think that bringing craft in is really a way to ignite excitement. This is a famous statue of Rocky. And the statue actually is outside an art museum. So Jörn Murmer thought, well, let's point out the fact that so many tourists come to see the statue of Rocky, but they don't actually go inside the museum. And that's one of the interesting things, is that craftivism projects really can bring people together and maybe bring people into a space like a library museum wouldn't normally go in. It can also sort of subvert our landscape a little bit, make you notice things that maybe go unnoticed. This is an art piece by a woman named Carol Yandel, who is here in Vancouver. This project was made during the 2010 Winter Olympics. And I don't know if this story really made it around the rest of the world, but in Canada, there was a lot of sensitivity to the Olympic sweaters that were being sold to tourists. And partly because those are made by a First Nations group here, that design, they're sort of recognized as being something from our First Peoples here. And these sweaters were being co-opted and manufactured in China and sold back to the public, when really they're a traditional symbol. So what Carolyn did is, well, I'm going to create something that sort of bends that idea on its head. So she created her own sweater, which both co-opted our First Nations people sweater, but also the sweaters that were being mass-produced and sold. And she placed in the Olympic rings and the Coca-Cola symbol and the McDonald's arches. And she had several people wear the sweater and wander around the Olympics as a sign of protest. Some people noticed it, some people didn't, but it was a way of subverting sort of the institution of the Olympics and how the Olympics locks down a city and who can pass and who can't pass. And this person did actually go undetected, which I found really interesting, because I lived downtown Vancouver during this time, and one side there were people celebrating on the street, and the other side there were riot squads trying to keep people in check. And there's this interesting thing where it's maybe because we don't look at textiles as being something glossy or something that should be paid attention to. So there is this wonderful window to subvert the ordinary and create small change. And looking back now at these photos as sort of a historical piece, I think, you know, Carolyn made her point much more than any newspaper article could have. And it's wonderful to see how, you know, this piece was facilitated by the artists who wore it. At a certain point in time, Douglas Copeland actually wore it through the crowd as well. And if you don't know Douglas Copeland, he's one of our more famous visual artists here and writers in Vancouver. He was known for Generation X. He's the person who coined that term. This is another sort of changing spaces example. This is Ulrika Erdes, and she really fell in love with old Swedish embroidery patterns. So in her town in Sweden, she started to go to public transit and apply traditional embroidery patterns to public spaces. And so the phrase on the seat says hello in Swedish. And the idea is, of course, that sometimes institutional spaces are things like public transit. We pay for it, but we're not allowed to customize it. Sometimes women don't always feel free or safe being there. So the idea is that Ulrika could use reference material to change that space. Is it legal? Probably not. But you know, this idea could be applied to other things that would work within a library context. What about cushions or pillows? And lastly, this is a group stitched by Climbing Poetry. So Climbing Poetry are actually two spoken word artists who, when I spoke to them, they don't consider themselves textile artists at all. But they've been doing this wonderful community project for the last 10 years. Every time they have a show, they give everybody who's attending their show a Sharpie and a piece of fabric, a little square. And the squares go on each of the seats in the audience. So people come in and they're invited to write something. So they get all sorts of phrases from people. They get people who want to tell them I'm coming out in this year. People who are angry because they have a relative who's incarcerated. People who are excited because they got a dog. It's a whole gamut of different stories that they collect each time they do a show. And then they stitch them together like they're prayer flags. And this project has grown so much that they can't travel with all of it, but they travel with a portion of it, and it becomes the dressings for spaces where they do their work. They take it with them when they work with youth who have been incarcerated and help dress up classrooms and spaces. And they said there's something about textiles that softens the area that you're in, and it allows people to share things that maybe they wouldn't share on paper. One, because of the memory that gets associated with cloth. Two, because it feels different, a little bit private. And there's a way of, when they're putting things together, they don't sort the information, saying like, these are stories that are sad or these are stories that are hopeful. They put them all together because that's a gamut of stories that aren't really provided in news. They're from the US, right? So they said like, there's not, with them particularly, I think, I find at least being Canadian, with American news, there's so many filters on the news that it's hard to hear real people's stories. And this is their attempt at collecting the stories of real people. They've even joked that this project could be a new American flag because there's stories that aren't represented in traditional news media. So tip number 7 is how can you create a place where people can exchange ideas with one another? So there's a few more projects I'm going to show you. This is one of my favorite, and this is something to think about, maybe how artists are working in your community to engage people, and maybe how they could come into your space and engage others. This is a project by Liz Kideke called The Urban Fabric, and what Liz does is she stitches large maps of cities. So she'll go into a place, city square, say in Mexico City or here in Vancouver. She's done this project in New York and in India. And she creates this large fabric map of neighborhoods. And then as people come up to her, or she calls people to her table, she'll say, tell me about your neighborhood. Tell me about where you fell in love. Tell me about what's a bad neighborhood. Tell me where you like to hang out. And she asks people to stitch a symbol onto this map. So maybe it's a heart for a place you fell in love. Maybe it's a black dot for a bad neighborhood. And the idea isn't so much about covering the map, but getting people to talk. So the place that somebody thinks is a bad neighborhood might be somebody's home. The place where somebody thinks needs a garden, it's a place where somebody goes to work every day. So the idea is in stitching together, you ignite a conversation. And she says this project has gone differently in all sorts of cities. So in India, all the men know how to stitch. So she gets lots of men participating. In Mexico City, everybody knows how to stitch, men and women. So everybody rushes to the table. In New York City, she has to show most people how to thread a needle. So it changes in geography depending on where this project goes and who interacts with it. Jessica Vligna is an artist who lives in the Yukon, and this is part of a project called Community Confessionals. And what Jessica did is she sourced vintage linens, and she had a box where anyone could write a story or a piece of advice and put their story into the box. And then completely anonymously, she takes them out, and then she takes what they wrote and applies them herself to embroidery pieces, and sometimes she illustrates them, such as this one, piece of advice, takes more risks and never trust bears, very appropriate for the Yukon. So the idea is the artist becomes a conduit of community stories. So people don't actually have to make something, but the artist will make something on their behalf. And the collection of pieces sort of becomes the voice of the community. This is a project by Lee Redman. So Lee has a niece. That's if you look at the tag with the illustration with the rosy cheeks, that's her niece. And her niece has a rare form of anemia. And unfortunately, Lee is not able to donate blood to her niece. Her niece needed a ton of blood transfusions as a small child. So her way of raising awareness for her niece's disorder was to actually start people making textile blood bags. So she's collected over 50 of these at this point, but it's an open project for anyone who can't donate blood or would prefer to craft something and donate blood at the same time to make their own version of what a blood bag might look like by hand. So I've shown lots of different examples. So I just thought I'd go through a few things. If you're thinking of designing a a community project where people participate. There's a few stages. One, discovery. So maybe you want to host some brainstorming sessions, invite people into a space, book a room, get them to discuss what's meaningful to them, what's igniting them, what they want to know more about, what they think should change or be improved in their community. Phase 2 would be skill sharing. What are people good at? Knitting isn't something that can be learned overnight. So, who has skills that they can share? Who has skills? What skills do people want to learn? How can things be made more basic for children? How can you really use the skills of people who are masters at what they do? So you'll find all of those in your community. Co-conspirators are always good. I've been very involved in the Maker Faire Hackspace communities where I live. So who else can help you? Are there local businesses that can donate material? Are there knitting or crafting guilds who would love to come and teach skills? Is there an artist working in your community that already might be working with the ideas that you've been thinking of? Is there a community arts council that can help lend facilitation and other space? Are there people who can promote your event, blogs, that sort of thing, that can actually get people to attend? And then design and creation. So I think one thing that is important with a community project is to know roughly what you want it to look like at the end. You can never decide exactly what something will look like when it's made by many hands, but you can pick a theme color, you can pick a theme material, you can decide we're going to cover an object like a bus or a plane. You can decide that we're all going to make one thing. Everybody's making a hat. So what the basic parameters that people are working with. An installation date's always good. I find when people are making things, they also want to be involved with putting them together. Sometimes you'll find people who just want to put things together. So it's always good to have those hands on deck and to give people a day to show up and really celebrate what they've made together. Documentation is always important. Make sure there's somebody to capture photos or video and truly celebrate what's gone into making something. And lifespan. One thing that I always get asked with yarn bombing projects is how long do they last? I would say they last as long as you decide they can last. I live in a rainforest, so at a certain point in time we'll get stroopy and looks fairly terrible. So most people I know will plan for something to go up for 3 months or 6 months and then come down. Sometimes a project will go up for 2 weeks and a community will choose to take it down and break it apart. Sometimes things are just made to be left and see how they deal if they're outside with natural elements, or maybe it's a installation that comes inside or travels. So it's good to figure out what the lifespan of something can be. And so one last slide, what can you do to facilitate large acts of making? So I think this is where libraries are really well placed, because you do all of these things all the time, which is gather people together, let them know something's happening, be a host, welcome them inside, listen to their ideas, choose several crafts, one or several. I think it's always good to offer an alternative. So if something is knitted, I offer crochet. If there's embroidery, maybe I'll, you always want to make sure that as many people can access the craft as possible. Same with storytelling. You'll always get somebody who wants to write outside the lines. So if you're putting together a story, someone else may want to add poetry. It's good to be open that way. Don't be too rigid. Brainstorm a cause. My mother worked in the library system for many years, and they had a campaign, Love Your Library. And it was amazing to see how many people came up with different things to love their library. They had heart yarn bombing. They had somebody that delivered pies to the library staff. They had people that planted flowers outside of the library. So brainstorm maybe around a common cause and see what people do around that. Provide resources. I think inspiration can come from many things. So you might be knitting, but then you're also into superheroes. You might be researching environmental politics, but maybe looking at eco-making and landscape art is also interesting. So how can our resources you have mingle with other resources? And finally, find advocates. So find advocates within the system. You know, you'll have other people on staff who really enjoy making things or community projects. You'll have patrons who have strong opinions, and you'll have artists in your community who will want to help. Once you get the word out there, it's always, you'll be amazed with who you can find who will support you. So I'm not quite sure what time we're at, but I'd love to chat with you and ask questions and hear your feedback. So maybe I'll open it up from here.
Okay, hi, can you see me there? I'm Cameron here from State Library. We do have a few minutes, so what I'll ask people to do is come up and speak to the camera. But yeah, look, thank you so much, Leanne. That was really inspirational. I think we can really learn from some of those bits of advice that you gave us. All right. Questions, anyone?
Hello, I'm Lee. I'm from Blacktown Library in Western Sydney. I'm also the Secretary of the Australian Storytelling Guild, New South Wales. We have a quilt that we use for whenever we hold an event, and on the quilt we have a panel for each of the professional storytellers that represents their signature story. And we often have it at events, and we will get the storytellers to get up and tell their story that's on their panel. Do you have things like that where once that you've made a community project, you then get the people to come and tell the story that's they're part of the project?
We have done that, yeah. So with the tree image that I showed at Joy Kagawa House, we sort of did that two ways. So that was actually done in a house that we're trying to make into a writer's residency. So we actually had days where we had people making things, and then we had local writers come and read to us. So there were reading series done alongside the making series. So there's this wonderful mix of craftspeople and writers reading. And then the days that we put everything together, we had people stand around the tree and tell their stories around pieces of the tree. And then after that, we encouraged pieces of writing, and the house did publish some of that writing on their website and their blog as well. So there was sort of a campaign of writing and making and storytelling around that piece.
Hi, I'm Annette from Leichhardt Library. I just had one quick question and then a bit of a longer one. You had a slide about the definition of craftivism, but I couldn't quite get that. Who did you say wrote that? Betsy something?
Betsy Greer. So it's Greer.
Okay, thanks. And my other question was, I'm a bit of a nerd and I could probably stand to be more subversive. How do you, when you're working in for a public council, how do you straddle that kind of divide, I guess, between what is a great community project and may express something that is really important to the community and illegal things?
That's a good question.
The hearts in the fencing and stuff like that, which is really beautiful and powerful. But when you're actually a representative of the council, you kind of need to do the right thing as well. So how do you kind of speak to that?
For sure. So I would say gauge the community that you live in. I mean, I live in Vancouver, Canada, which has been a fairly permissive place for illegal activity. And we actually had a city councillor on board with our cherry tree project. So I was actually knitting in councillor chambers with one of our city councillors who invited us there. Not all communities are that permissive. So what I would do is actually find a space where you have permission. Maybe it's an empty lot where you know, it might be going to development in a few years, or a community garden where you can receive permission ahead of time. That would probably, for a public program, what I would stress. Work with the groundskeeper of the library. If you're going to do it at a library, make sure that everybody from facilities actually is on board, and communicate. So if the piece is only going to be up for 2 weeks, you can communicate that the time period that this is on the landscape is for 2 weeks, and then it's coming down and being repurposed for other things. So I don't think everything needs to be an act of guerrilla art. I think sometimes just putting art in a place where it's unexpected, or writing in a place where it's unexpected is enough. So it's finding out where you need to find permission. Step 2 of that is encourage people to be safe. So I would never encourage, say, yarn bombing that would cover a reflective sign. I ask people to use their best judgment, but to really think about, you know, you might want to cover a stairwell that you know isn't well used, but if it's a place where you know you have people who are dealing with access needs or wheelchairs, you're not going to want to yarn bomb that spot. So it's making sure that, you know, whatever you're doing is inclusive to as many people possible, and that you are representing an institution, and you do need buy-in for that. I did work for a community arts council for several years, and after writing my books, the woman that I'd worked for called me up and said, we want to do yarn bombing as a public program. And it became quite controversial, actually. Their city council said, why are we giving the Arts Council money to do yarn bombing? This is graffiti. And there were several newspaper articles, and there were city council meetings about how dare this happen. You know, this isn't what we give money to the arts for. And people in the public wrote letters and said, well, the Arts Council can decide what is art. They can decide what public programming is. The City Council doesn't decide this, the Arts Council does. The Arts Council chose to run a yarn bombing program. They provided people yarn that they could pick up with a deposit. They knit for several community projects in public parks with they had the permission of the Parks Board. And when they were finished, it was their most successful project to date. They had 300 participants in a community that typically gets 80 participants for a public project. So look at precedents. If there's something you're trying to establish, look at what other communities have done and look at their success rates, because that may help you sell the project to the people you need to push it through.
Okay, thank you. Look, that's all we've got time for from Leanne. And Leanne's presentation, all of her slides will be available to everybody. So we give Leanne a round of applause. And while Ellen switches us off from